Hey, this is Ina in with you in the Fight Back, and today I want to go over Marx's dialectical method, his method of dialectical analysis. And in discussing Marx's approach to political economy, where this method is most clearly applied, we approach some of his most important and original contributions, which involve those of methodology. And according to George Lucas, the orthodoxy of Marxism is not in any of its particular conclusions, but relates exclusively to its method. And for the purposes of this video, I will absolutely agree with that. Now, formally, if we look at Marx's analysis of economy, his methodology is actually rather similar to that of his classical predecessors and his neoclassical successors. For Marx is an adherent of the abstract deductive method that is also the trait of the Ricardian school, whose most famous member would of course be David Ricardo. And Marx uses abstraction. So keep that in mind because that's going to come up a lot through the course of the video. For Marx practiced a method known as successive approximations. And this consists of, and listen closely, in moving from the more abstract to the more concrete in a step-by-step fashion, removing and simplifying assumptions at successive stages of the investigation so that theory may take account of and explain an ever wider range of actual phenomena. If you have to, just rewind and listen. But hopefully this will become clear as we go through it. Now, Marx's method does differ from other classical and neoclassical economists. For instance, the principle of abstraction is itself actually powerless to yield knowledge because the difficult questions arises to the manner of its application. And you need to decide what to abstract from and what not to abstract from. And in this regard, two issues arise. One, what problem is being investigated? Simple enough. Two, what are the essential elements of that problem? Now, if we're able to answer these questions and we know what to abstract from, and we're able from here to frame our assumptions according to the criteria of convenience and simplicity. But economists are actually not always agreed about the objectives. They actually differ on what they're investigating. So, for instance, Adam Smith is looking at the nature and the causes of the wealth of nations. David Ricardo is looking at the laws which regulate the distribution of the produce of the earth. Now, there is certainly some overlap, and I could name other economists as well, but we can actually say that their objectives are not identical. And since the objectives and the problems being investigated are actually differ, how each of these economists handle their material, including the method of abstraction, will actually differ. And we should keep this in mind with Marx, whose objective is to lay bare the economic laws of motion of modern society. And once an investigator has a task, there is really no simple formula to guide his footsteps. You need to bring the essential into relief, into focus, to make possible its analysis. That is the specific task of abstraction. So where do we start? Well, once we know, how do we distinguish the essential from the non-essential? And the methodology can pose questions, but it can't provide ready-made answers. In practice, it is necessary to formulate hypotheses about what is essential, to work these hypotheses through, and to check the conclusions against the data of experience. For a particular theorist, such as Marx or Adam Smith, you need to identify the key hypotheses and to see where that particular theorist gets them from and how he develops their implications. Now, in the case of Karl Marx, we actually know quite enough about his intellectual development to make this attempt. His background is, of course, then in philosophy and jurisprudence, and his encounter with communism and political economy in the 1840s. So, When Marx, in his preface to, gives this actually in his preface to a contribution of a critique of political economy, and he kind of lays bare where he's coming from, his thinking. And he says that the legal relations and the state, they can't be understood by themselves, so they really can't be looked at upon in isolation, nor explained as the progress of the human mind, which would be a critique of idealism here. Rather, legal relations and the state are rooted in the material conditions of life, which can be summed up as civil society. And that in order to understand that the anatomy of civil society, how it's made up, is to be sought in political economy. And Marx's guiding thread in these studies can be summed up as follows. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely, relations of production, appropriate to a given stage in the development of the material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. Or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. We can see from this passage, from a preface to a contribution of a political economy, that Marx's primary interest is that of society as a whole, especially the progress of social change. In political economy, the anatomy of society is significant here because that is where we can actually find the impetus of social change. And Marx is not reducing everything to economic terms, as many non-Marxists or anti-Marxists like to claim. Rather, he attempts to uncover the true interrelation between economic and non-economic factors in the totality of social life. And any number of his works can provide examples of this. Once Marx reached his conclusion that the key to social change is to be found in the movements of the mode of production, he was committed to a study of political economy from the standpoint of the laws governing changes in the mode of production. With this objective, could one recognize the essential aspects of the problem? And the essential aspects seem to stand up with deep studies into the actuality of historical development. Here, Marx looks at the process and development through the conflict of opposed or contradictory forces. For Marx, historical conflicts are rooted in the mode of production, or rather, to be even more specific, in the class struggle itself. And economic forces manifest themselves in class societies such as capitalism by the class struggle. From here, the essential economic relations are those which underlie and express themselves in the form of class struggle. These are the essential relations which must be isolated and analyzed through the method of abstraction. Other economists look at the roots of the class struggle as well, and they tend to look at things such as land and rent, or the struggle between landlords and capitalists. Marx rejects this approach. Agriculture in bourgeois society is in fact dominated by capital. Capital is the dominating power in modern society. It is this is the starting point that you must take before you analyze land ownership, that of looking at the dominance of capital. For Marx, in modern society, the primary economic relation is not in fact that of a land-owning gentry and that of, say, serfs, but rather is that between labor and capital. And this relation is the center of his investigation. And the power of abstraction must be used to isolate it, labor and capital, and reduce it to its purest form, to enable it to be subjected to the most painstaking analysis, free of all unrelated disturbances. And this process means adopting two distinct steps. One, all social relations, except that between labor and capital, must be provisionally assumed away, but they are to be reintroduced one at a time, only at a later stage of analysis. Two, the labor-capital relation must be reduced to its most significant form or forms. Significant here means the question of the structural characteristics and tendencies of the whole society. And Marx reduces capitalists and workers to the standard types from which all characteristics irrelevant to the relation under investigation are essentially removed. And the nature of the capital relation is, in form, it is an exchange relation. The capitalist buys labor power from the worker, and the worker in return receives money for the necessities of life. Yet we have exchange relations here. We have a common form, a common structure, and we need to begin with an analysis of the general phenomena of exchange. And that is Marx's starting point. And Marx, in fact, begins capital with commodities. And we have a definition of a commodity is something that is intended for exchange rather than direct use. And when analyzing commodities, this involves an analysis of exchange relations and the quantitative aspect, again, the exchange value. And this, from here, we go to an analysis of money. And once having analyzed commodities, Marx begins his main task. And he looks at the labor-capital relation in its isolated and purified forms, and thus capital uses to analyze this relation, das Kapital, a high level of abstraction. Now, Marx uses abstraction not to get away from the real world, not to get away from real problems and struggles, but to isolate certain aspects of the real world for investigation. In order to accomplish this, he uses historical and factual data. For instance, when reading the chapter on the working day or the labor process, for example, you can see Marx quoting from those British factory inspectors to make his point. And when Marx operates at a high level of abstraction, we are really dealing with a relatively small number of aspects of reality, but it is supported by historical and factual data. This means that the results of Das Kapital Volume 1 have a certain provisional character. In many cases, they undergo a modification at a lower level of abstraction when more aspects of reality are taken into account in the later volumes of Capital. Thus, the laws and tendencies of Volume 1 of Das Kapital are not to be interpreted as direct predictions of the future, and their validity is actually relative to the level of abstraction on which they are derived and the extent of the modifications which they must undergo when the analysis is brought to a more concrete level. Now, let's just stop for a second, and if you see this fact, this avoids so many controversies around Marx, his method, and the whole argumentation of Das Kapital. For anti-Marxists, they look at something such as the law of the increasing misery of the proletariat, which Marx called the absolute law of capitalist accumulation, and they say that, well, this law has been disproven, and therefore Marx's whole theory of capitalism is to be shoved aside. But in fact, the law is at a high level of abstraction, and it doesn't constitute in any way a concrete prediction of the future. And after laying out this law, Marx says, like other laws, it is modified in its working by many circumstances which don't concern us here. So anti-Marxists, consider yourself owned, you've been shot down. So Marx is clear, and the anti-Marxists lose. And in the structure of Capital, in the later volumes, other factors that were left out of Volume 1 of Das Kapital are taken up. They are analyzed through the abstract method. And the process brings the analysis to a lower level of abstraction, making it more concrete. And many criticisms of Marx's economics, his political economy, are consciously or unconsciously based upon a rejection of the assumptions under which he works, which have been laid out for you here. Now, when dealing with criticisms of Marx, when criticisms come up, and these criticisms may invariably involve his abstraction method, that three questions generally arise. One, are they framed, the criticisms, with proper regard for the problem under investigation? Two, do they eliminate the non-essential elements of the problem? Three, do they stop short of eliminating the essential elements? If we can answer in the affirmative in all cases, then the principle of appropriate abstraction has been observed. And this principle helps to test the range of Marx's criticisms and that of his detractors as well. Now, furthermore, with Marx's method, and for me as a historian particularly important, is that his method is historical. He sees that social reality is not so much a specified set of relations, rather, it is the process of change in a specified set of relations. It is a historical process, which knows no finality or stopping points. Social systems, like individuals, go through life cycles. They grow and they die. They pass away when the forms of development of the forces of production turn into fetters. Very simplistic, but you get the point. And the process of social change isn't mechanical. Different systems don't succeed each other the way the sun rises every day. Rather, the process of social change is the product of human action, but it is action limited by the kind of society under which it has its roots. As Marx famously says, men make history, but they don't make it under circumstances under which they choose. And society, in fact, is changing due to the relative laws of motion, and it can be changed by people, consciously and unconsciously, for instance, through revolutionary struggle. Marx's approach is historical, which we can even further clarify to means that he takes a critical approach to every form of society. I cannot overstate this enough. Non-Marxists and anti-Marxists look at older societies, primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, tributary, as transitory, as historical. They see that, yes, these societies, they grew and they died and they're gone now. Makes sense. But they don't do that with capitalism. They see it as almost eternal. They take it for granted. As Marx says, they saw history, but now there's no history any longer. And the difference here is between Marxists and non-Marxists is not that of intelligence. There are plenty of intelligent non-Marxist historians and thinkers. Rather, it is a question, or rather the difference is, of method and approach. In contemporary society, so many take the system for granted. You can criticize and understand it within the framework of the system. Many thinkers and historians do that. Yet they can't understand what happens to the system itself. They really can't. They can't see this whole totality. And many can deny that you can even talk about a social system. At one point, we're talking about the end of ideology, the end of capitalism. So-called, it had been replaced by something called the industrial society, or the mass society, or whatever name you wanted to use. And so many commentators and so many thinkers and pundits on the media, they don't look at the social systems. They don't look at history as a totality, history through the workings and intercontradictions of a whole social structure, for instance, of capitalism. They don't see that. Yet history, in fact, involves whole social systems, as Marx clearly lays out. And Marx's premise is that capitalism is historical, i.e., it is transitory. It grows and it dies. And he sees human action as responsible for changes which the system has undergone and will undergo. And that a critical attitude is absolutely necessary, absolutely essential. Not just for perhaps moral reasons, but it has practical importance. Because philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.